right, our penultimate panel. We got one lightning round and one panel remaining, but here to talk to us about the Modernizing the Homeland Security Enterprise Research and Development Program is Dr. Charles Clancy. He's the Senior Vice President, General Manager at MITRE Labs, but also MITRE's Chief Futurist. And I think we can all agree research and development across the enterprise is led from the bottom up at this point. We've heard talk about the need for a national industrial base policy, the need for a more cohesive R&D policy across DHS, but here to explore how we might actually put that into action, I'll leave it to Dr. Charles Clancy. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, and thanks all for sticking around. We're in the home stretch here. So I'd like to start by just having each of our panelists give a quick self-introduction, and then we'll get underway.
Great, thanks so much. I'm Kara LaPointe. I'm here from the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab, and I'm co-director of something called the Johns Hopkins Institute for Assured Autonomy, where we make sure that all things that are AI-enabled work like they're supposed to.
Yeah. My name is Reddick, Managing Director with Deloitte Consulting, responsible for our work within several of the DHS components to include headquarters, as well as FEMA, Secret Service, as well as CISA and INA.
Terrific. Dan Prieto, Head of Cybersecurity Strategy for Google Cloud Public Sector, as well as a member of Homeland Security Experts Group. Before Google, I was Director for Cybersecurity Policy on the National Security Council staff at the White House, and also Chief Technology Officer in the DoD CIO's office.
Great. Well, so I'm excited to have such a distinguished panel here to talk with us about this issue. So a little bit of scene setting. Why are we talking about R&D right now? Well, lots of reasons to be talking about R&D, but we're also at a very interesting moment in sort of bipartisan interest in increasing U.S. investment in R&D. And well, why are we in that position? Certainly China is a big reason for that. There's a lot of concern that China is outpacing us with their R&D investments. But we've also seen steady decline in U.S. federal investment in R&D as a nation. At sort of the peak of the Manhattan Project and Apollo program, we were seeing roughly 2% of U.S. GDP being invested in terms of federal R&D investment nationally. Now we're in a position where around 0.6% of GDP is being invested in terms of federal R&D. So we've seen it more than 1/3 what it was at its peak back in the 1950s and 60s. Now, of course, industry has picked up their investment. Industry's more than doubled their investment in R&D over that same period. And so we've also seen this sort of natural shift to a much greater dependence on industrial innovation combined with federal innovation as we think about addressing the R&D needs of the U.S. government. But we have a new administration, and just some of the numbers that have been talked about. The Biden campaign promised $300 billion in new R&D investment as part of their strategy. The White House infrastructure plan promised about $500 billion in new R&D spending. And now, of course, we're watching the president's budget come together and be assessed on the Hill. There's all kinds of other legislation floating around, the Endless Frontiers Act, notably, that are investing in different aspects of this. We'll have to see what actual numbers come out next fiscal year. But depending on how you count, this is anywhere from the potential for a 20% to as much as a 50% increase in U.S. investment in R&D, which is huge, particularly as DoD's R&D budgets are pretty much flat. I'll also note that DHS&T's budget is only about a 7% increase in the midst of all of this significant increase in federal R&D investment. So I would sort of posture, my thesis here is that we are kind of at the precipice of having the opportunity to fundamentally change how we as a nation innovate. We're talking about some of the largest increase in federal R&D investment in a long time. And a lot of that, of course, has to do with how the U.S. can maintain its competitiveness on a global stage. But then the question is, well, how does the Homeland Security Enterprise fit into that? How can it effectively leverage those investments for addressing its concerns and enabling its missions? So I'd like to open it up to sort of each of the panelists to sort of reflect on that and talk a little bit about the opportunity they think this represents for the nation, and then more specifically for the Homeland Security Enterprise. Kara?
Sure. I think it's amazing that we're going to get increased investment, right? But I think Claire said it really well before that, we tend to throw money and people at a problem, and then we figure out the innovative solutions when that doesn't work alone. So I'd say money is necessary to increase investment in these areas, but it alone is not sufficient, right? This is really an ecosystem problem. It's a human challenge. It's not a technical challenge to figure out R&D. We live in a society that has thriving innovation in the private sector, thriving innovation in the parts of the public sector, the labs, the FFRDCs and UARCs, right? But we have to figure out those enablers to be able to harness that innovation, right? We've heard about different acquisition ways to do that, about different authorities like other transactional authority and how we can better leverage those so that we can harness that. And one of the particular challenges is harnessing that innovation for those missions that are uniquely governmental, right? Because that's what the financial incentives of this electronics commercial market we have are not going to drive. So I think that we have the power to do that. We just have to think about the whole ecosystem of the problem and not rely on the fact that increased investment alone is going to solve this problem for us.
Okay. Andy?
Yeah, I would agree with that. And it really comes down to, I believe, that technology and the innovation aren't the real challenges. I think it's the people in the process. So we've heard from several people, today talking about whether it's acquisition, whether it's helping small businesses or organizations that have innovations that they want to get into the hands of the people that can use them. How do they do that? And until we, take a hard look at those processes and quite frankly, really, figure them out for all technologies. If we look at emerging technologies that are no longer emerging, but in the past, things like cloud and other technologies like that. They were emerging, 10, maybe plus years ago. But the challenge with cloud and some of those technologies you looked at were things like the accreditation process. So we went from DIACAP to DISCAP to RMF, and that slowed the adoption of a technology. And those same things still persist now, and they will continue to persist in the future unless we take a hard look at the people and processes and really, say, how can we make them pliable, maybe more flexible, to be ready to adopt those technologies that come our way.
A couple quick things. First of all, just as a disclaimer, my comments today are my own, reflect my background at my organizations, but personal opinions. I think I agree largely with what's been said before, and I want to sort of encapsulate some of what's been said. Eric Schmidt, Google's former CEO and chair, said, look, he was talking about DoD, but I think this applies to this conversation. He said DoD doesn't have an innovation problem. It has an innovation adoption problem, right? And this speaks to the people and process, right? I agree that the reason that shift, percentage of GDP, government share of R&D has declined is because venture capital firms, private firms have really picked up the slack at the bleeding edge of innovation, right? You think about cyber. Everybody tends to think we need a lot of innovation in cyber. I looked in Crunchbase yesterday. There are 9,600 cybersecurity firms listed in Crunchbase. There is no shortage of innovation at the technical level, right? The problem is, though, how do you get the innovation that is technical into pilots, into adoption, into operationalization, into regularization, and then into scale on government-specific use cases? So I think we need to marry technical innovation with innovation around operating models, innovation around process, the willingness to disrupt process. The reality with government is that so much of process is people and paper-driven. And so with that, I want to pick up the comment that cloud is in the rearview mirror. I don't agree with that. We've been talking about cloud since the cloud first policy, which was 10 years ago. Cloud adoption as a percentage of spend, IT spend in the government, is still sub 10%. We are, if you think baseball, that's first inning, second inning. And the reason there's that disconnect between cloud being an innovative technology platform and cloud being applied in a results-oriented way, in a way that reduces toil, that reduces inefficiency, is because we haven't translated these ideas into actually disrupting and changing business process. And I think to some of the stuff we did on COVID with a number of states, people suffered with contact tracing, PPE inventory management, forecasting and modeling around COVID. The cloud, lightweight applications, application program interfaces, data collection using cell phones, we were able to innovate that in a number of short weeks with a number of states without taking the heavy, historic requirements, long cycle technology build process. So the technology is there. And look, the cloud, to your point, is good at a couple things in a way that old technology was not. Scale, massive scale, speed, agility, security, and cost. The reason that cloud adoption has lagged, even though we've been talking about it for 10 years, is because people, it's such a huge culture change. That's not the way I've ever done my IT. And because it's not me doing it, I don't trust it. The 2018 Goldman Sachs survey that about 60% of respondents said their big issue with moving to cloud was still this perception that it's not as secure as them building their own stuff, right? I think that's shifting. We ran a survey, just a couple weeks ago, 200 or so senior government IT leaders, and there's now about a 85% acceptance that, you know what, the cloud can be more secure. And that speaks to a greater willingness, a greater openness to really partner with the government. But I look forward to talking more about this.
So I agree that adoption obviously is a key challenge. I'll note that DHS and the Homeland Security Enterprise use cases, though, are not exactly the same as commercial use cases, right? So how does DHS, presuming that at the end of the day it's going to buy a commercial solution as a service for the actual deployed and operating system, how does it sort of swim upstream and influence the development of that technology so that it actually meets the requirements that doesn't even I think we have a challenge now where you try and write down all those requirements before the technology is fully baked, and you end up with sort of this chicken and egg problem. But how can we rethink the DHS approach to R&D that would shift towards being able to constructively influence the development of commercial technologies, which is ultimately going to be a large part of what they end up buying at the end? And so maybe, Kara, you could, certainly your background is in AI. I wonder if you have any thoughts on that specifically from the AI perspective.
Yeah, well, I think more generally, not just from AI, you have to figure out ways to collaborate and incentivize, right? And you have to incentivize all different pieces of the ecosystem that we're talking about, right? So the companies, you have to figure out ways to incentivize the companies. When you have emerging technologies that change very rapidly, and you have acquisition mechanisms that take a really long time to get things on contract, well, we have to find new ways to do that, right? Commercial solutions, opportunities type grants, or contracts and other things like that. But we also have to incentivize our own workforces, right? I think somebody said earlier, we don't have a way to make sure our workforce is getting to yes, right? So we have to figure out ways to incentivize our workforce so that they can get to yes. And what are those mechanisms that we can then collaborate and bring together and say, hey, these are the specific problems that we have in this mission space, right? Are there consortia we can build where you say we have this problem and there's actual money behind it because you've reduced some of the barriers from the actual government piece, or the government contracting piece, and you put money behind it and you bring different industries into one problem space. Maybe it's through a consortium mechanism, maybe it's through another collaboration mechanism, but that's what we have to do, is that we have to make this a shared problem as opposed to, I have a problem and I want you to solve it. We say, we collectively have a problem. And we have the resources. I love the AFWorks example before that that somebody had, where they literally were on the stage giving some money to small businesses, right? So reduce the barriers, bring us together in a collaboration space, whether it's a consortia or other kind of space, to solve shared problems.
Okay. So Eddie, I wonder, you've got a lot of experience across various DHS components. DHS S&T, I think, is a bit uneven in how it interconnects with those components, how it addresses those. Are there organizational things that could improve really the infrastructure inside DHS and the way that DHS S&T in particular supports the different missions of the components?
Yeah, I think there's been a lot of talk today about collaboration and how S&T partners with the components and really having a conversation about the roles and responsibilities, or even what Director Inglis talked about earlier, like really getting to a point of understanding, supporting and supported relationships between S&T and the components. I think that's really important from the concept of, the term used is Homeland Security Enterprise. What's the definition of enterprise? What does that mean? And what is everybody's role in an enterprise to make sure that we get to the outcomes we want to get to? For S&T, if I look at them, the challenge of operating and working with different components, and in many situations, having conversations with components individually, and then learning through those conversations that there are similarities across those components and being, in a role of integrator. Well, how do we make that happen sooner? How do we, bring in commercial organizations along for the ride so that it's a conversation that people have up front, as rather than one-off conversations that don't necessarily provide the opportunity for the collaboration that you want and the outcomes that you want to achieve. And then if you do that, you have the opportunity to then, better manage your spend, better manage your effort, your focus, and rather than spending time in one-off fashion. So I think the opportunity to bring people together and make it happen, make it second nature and how the enterprise works together is important.
So Dan, reflecting on some of your comments, I wonder, is the nature of dual use sort of changing? Sometimes I like to think of it as almost the commercial application is really driving the market, right? And the secondary application is the government one. I wonder your thoughts on, is it time to start thinking about dual use technologies with sort of it flipped over?
Let me back up a little bit from that question. In a lot of the use cases we're talking about, and again, just a quick comment as DHS thinks about its future. I mean, we're 20 years past sort of the start of the global war on terror. I want to step back a little bit in some of the mission areas where I think this innovation needs to occur. I think we've made the most innovation over the last 20 years on counterterrorism, full stop, because so much of the effort was focused on that, right? I think obviously we need to focus on migration, on cyber, on bio, on climate. And when I think climate, I definitely think disaster response, emergency preparedness and response. What's interesting about all of those topics is that they're all complex systems problems, right? And the people and the resources and the technology that are applied to those need to help address the complexity of those systemic problems, right? So I want to link to the comment earlier about incentives. In general, I think we have to change the discussion around AI. People are like, oh, we fear AI. AI is going to take our jobs. I think when you're dealing with knowledge workers, which are what analysts and people in government are, it is not going to take people's jobs. In fact, it is going to make you radically more efficient and effective at what you do, right? So by taking toil out of a really difficult or complicated or paper-based process, the incentive for people to work with the technology isn't that it's going to replace you, nor is it a black box that's going to make ethical decisions for you. It removes toil, right? Take the example of cyber. The amount of cyber telemetry in your average organization is doubling every year, every couple years. We implemented a cyber analytic platform, Google did, for New York City Cyber Command. They are ingesting 20 billion log events per day from several 100,000 users of the city, several 100,000 endpoints. There's no way you can ever solve that by throwing more people at it. So for all the discussion about hiring more people, you also have to think about 10xing the productivity of the people you have and hire, right? That's the way you incentivize them. Because say, look, you're never going to solve this just by more hands on keyboard. You have to be way better at what you do. In terms of how you incentivize the private sector, when thinking about complex systemic problems, I think Director Inglis got to this the other day. It is still not sufficiently clear to private sector actors on cyber, for example, what government is going to do to help them. Yes, they get information bulletins. Yes, there's some more investment dollars we can provide. Yes, we send out information on patches. But if you break any cyber attack into a framework that under the Obama administration we promulgated with a presidential policy directive on incident response, you can think about response to any attack and protection as dealing with the threat actor, who's the bad guy, the asset itself, which is basically what's the vulnerability, And then what we call the business response. How do I communicate to people that their data's been lost? How do I protect people from identity theft after there's a big data breach? The way we focused on cyber to date is by telling the private sector to cover down on your vulnerabilities. We have not made a sufficient enough offer to them to explain to them how we are going to systematically deal with the threat actors. And it can't just be prosecutions or the idea that if someone pings us on cyber, we're going to take out something of theirs. It has to be, for example, in the United States, if nation-state actors are spinning up attack infrastructure, command control infrastructure, what is the government going to do far left of boom, well before a private sector actor has to worry about protecting their own patch, right? And this starts getting to your conversation about use cases. So the use cases to me, of course, the technology is dual use, commercial application, government application, but equally important or more so than dual use government scenario versus commercial is a clearer delineation of roles and responsibilities and a clearer offer from government on what they are going to do to solve the systemic problems on these complex system issues. Because so much of the systemic problem stems from the fact that this country is organized in a highly pluralistic way. Things are fragmented, and by design, our Constitution was built that way. But that means, back to the industrial policy question, we're not good at having effort that is coordinated and collaborated because there are so many seams between civil and military, public and private, domestic and international. Those are the seams that adversaries, or not even adversaries, hurricanes, take advantage of, right?
If I could jump in on the systems engineering point for a second. It's true, this is a very complex system of systems engineering problem. But even more complex is that we're talking about digital technologies which need a different approach to systems engineering than our more traditional hardware technologies. A lot of our government systems engineering processes are focused on hardware. But we have software. At its essence, a lot of these emergent technologies are digital and they're software. And we need completely different ways of looking at it. For example, if you think about kind of acquisition versus sustainment, we often think of the biggest cost is when you first get something and then you establish it, you develop, you deploy it, and then you just have to sustain it. Well, when you talk about digital technologies, and this is where AI has a completely different model, you have to bring the idea of research and development into your operation and sustainment phase. That is a completely different mindset that we have not approached yet. And these are the kinds of fundamental organizational and policy and process challenges that we have to get over if we're going to actually realize the benefit of emerging technologies.
And I think from a systems engineering perspective, a very interesting part of that is test and evaluation, right? And I know certainly a lot of these digital technologies, we don't have good ways to do test and evaluation. Certainly in the cyber domain, it gets to checklists that get you different certification levels in the cloud. But in some of these other emerging areas like AI, right, where if you have a system that's been certified, but then it's able to learn new things in operation, right? How do you continue to test and evaluate and certify it? Let's see. So I wanted to give an example of a use case-based innovation approach that I think is working reasonably well, and it comes from DoD, where they have spent, I guess, phase one. It's the 5G-based pilots that DoD has been doing. I think this is an interesting example, and it might be something constructive we could use as a discussion point for how DHS might think about some of its larger scale investments. But essentially, DoD wanted to have all kinds of cool IoT use cases that would have military value, and really not so much acquire these and deploy them at bases around the country, but really create an environment where vendors could come together and be incentivized through OTA consortia and funded to figure out how to get all their different pieces working together, build the relationships among the vendors, so that at the other end of this, there would be a shrink-wrapped commercial product that DoD could ultimately go off and buy to use for 5G for a wide range of different use cases. And so, of course, it wasn't cheap. The phase one was, I think, $600 million. There's another phase that's about about to start. So it's pretty significant investment. But not only has it really catalyzed the domestic telecom ecosystem around 5G, the needs that DoD has, it's also really helped energize a domestic 5G vendor ecosystem in the first place, right? Because we'd lost much of our expertise in that domain to China, lost our ground to China as US companies merged with European counterparts over the last 20 years. So I find it sort of a fascinating example of where I think the dual use coin really has flipped, right? DoD is investing in these 5G pilots primarily because they're going to lead to economic competitiveness to the US, and as a result of being able to sort of shape the focus through these different use cases, there will be the opportunity for DoD to kind of buy service from the vendor ecosystem that matures through this process. Right, so I think of this as kind of a really interesting model where I think other agencies should look at trying to inject their requirements into prototyping, experimentation, and pilot sorts of activities. And I wonder if any of the panelists have ideas in other emerging technology areas where that model might work, particularly for DHS mission areas.
So I'll say I'm a huge proponent of the consortium model, right? For a lot of reasons. One, because these technologies move very fast. We need different ways of approaching these from a community-based perspective. We need collaboration, right? And by using a consortium, I came out of the DoD world on the acquisition side in the Navy. And if you were to go out to a vendor and say, hey, I need help just writing the statement of work for what I'm doing because I am not as smart as the vendor base right now in terms of how we're gonna talk about and how we wanna acquire this technology. You couldn't do that, right? Because of our acquisition regulations and federal regulations and laws. But if you have a consortium, the beauty of a consortium in some ways is you have symmetric access and symmetric information. So you can go out and to your whole kind of group of industry partners in a consortium and say, hey, let's figure out a way to make the government smarter on this technical issue so that the government can be smarter when we write our RFPs, when we do this process, right? Because the government, no sector alone has the full capability, capacity, and agency to implement emerging technologies, right? And so when you can find innovative ways that you bring industry in, you bring government in, you bring academia in, and you can pool that knowledge, that's the only way we're going to be able to collectively go farther, faster together.
Okay. Eddie, any thoughts?
Yeah, so you talked about some of these use cases, and you mentioned 5G. And so our firm has been involved with one with the Navy around smart warehousing. And that smart warehousing effort leverages 5G technology to connect systems such as your asset management system, your inventory control systems, potentially wearables from the individual, as well as biometrics, so that you can have situational awareness on all things that are happening in that warehouse. And that's technology that's being leveraged on the commercial side. And when we talk about dual use, I mean, much of the business of the government is also the business of the commercial side. Financial management systems, inventory control, supply chain systems, even cyber, those are the same challenges that our commercial counterparts are dealing with, and they've invested in those systems, and they can be brought over because we use SAP, they use SAP. They're leveraging, some of the same technologies and pulling them together for, a whole, in a broader solution. So those are available and can be replicated because the processes and the outcomes are the same, regardless of whether you're commercial or you're working on the government side.
Thinking through that, where these consortium models might work, or where it would make sense for groups to get together to think about requirements that are more business outcome oriented as opposed to inputs oriented, which is too often the case, I think, on a lot of procurements. I think there's a couple areas I think of. One is the Internet of Things and the increased sort of, risk to an automation of industrial control systems, right? These undergird our critical infrastructure. This is a new realm for cyber. Yes, we've been talking about it for many years, but the IoT surge is coming, and we know nation-state adversaries are very much targeting our critical infrastructure, so the risk is going up. And historically, our security focus has been on information technology systems and not enough on operating technologies that control operating systems. A second area is around supply chain. Supply chains, are, I think, among the poster children for complex global systems that are flooded with tons of data, but the challenge is how do you make sense of the data at scale, because the data volumes are so big, and how do you connect data together because it can be so fragmented. So in the areas I'm thinking are important are much better real-time visibility into the supply chains. Where are points of risk? Where are points of interconnection? Where are points of potential cascading failure that you wouldn't notice if you were looking just at sequentially different parts of the supply chain? I think there are scale issues on the inspection side in terms of inspecting whether hardware in your supply chain may have been tampered with or be fraudulent. Same thing on code. We saw this with SolarWinds. So many things come into the enterprise, and because they came from a trusted third party and that third party code was signed, we presume it's okay. But there's not enough, and this is difficult to do. How do you inspect those things? And you don't necessarily have a signature of a bad section of code. It's how are they behaving? Is this version of software, this version of SolarWinds versus that version of SolarWinds, it's doing 5 new things, and it's never done these 5 things before. Why is it trying to access an administrator control point? Why is it trying to access a financial database, for example? The third area that I thought of in terms of innovation, again, very data-driven, very complex, but you need much better foresight and insight, is on modeling and mapping around fire, around flood, around hurricane, right? Those groups, particularly weather, there is an interdisciplinary core working through FEMA, working through governors that knows how to deal with hurricanes. But there are large parts of the country that don't have the muscle memory because they're not used to getting hit by hurricanes. You have large parts of the country that aren't used to having drought conditions or fire conditions. So you need to arm people with more data, the visualization of that data, and the ability to have more foresight and predict, again, fire, flood, hurricane, and all that like. Again, complex, large-scale, systems-oriented data that, I think the technology can give any user a much greater ability to make sense of it and can actually democratize the access to those kind of analytics.
So I think we've had a lot of examples here of sort of engineering and technology-related innovation, but we just had a great panel on civics, and I'm curious, should DHS be investing in research and development in the social sciences beyond kind of the hard tech spaces?
Absolutely. All right. I work on assured autonomy, right, which is making AI and autonomous systems work. And I'm an autonomous systems engineer. But I always include people in the system, right? Mm-hmm. It's really the intersection between technology and humanity that's important. It's those intersection lines. And if you don't have social scientists at the table, you are never going to solve the problems that you want to solve. If you just bring technologists to solve a problem that is fundamentally a human challenge, you won't ever get there.
Mm-hmm. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I am not a social scientist, but I would say, yes, the intersection of people and technology is very important. I think the idea of understanding the impact to people as you roll out that technology, how people receive that technology. You talk about AI. In one of the sessions earlier, we talked about how you can use AI to basically identify potentially fraud, maybe in somebody in FEMA who's making false claims. There's also the opportunity potentially to leverage that AI to let people know in that same area who haven't made claims, who don't know that they have money that's available to them. And maybe the opportunity is to say, hey, your neighbor has filed a claim and you haven't. Why not? Do you know this money is available to you? And use it as a positive. And so it's not just, find the bad guy, identify the bad actor. It's also along with some sort of stakeholder or outreach effort to let people know that this technology found you, and that's why I'm reaching out to you, because you're missing an opportunity to take advantage of something that's available to you. And I think that's important.
I'm glad you brought this up because I think it is absolutely fundamental that we also invest in the social sciences on the R&D side, and for the following reasons. We have one nation-state adversary that is actively trying to corrode and undermine our civil society. Full stop, right? We have another nation-state adversary that is seeking to gain advantage on the economic front through a close coordination of national industrial policy and also leaping ahead through intellectual property theft. Both of those things have to do with liberal, capitalist, democratic society, right? Those aren't science things. And the things that analytics and AI ML can help with are around sentiment analysis, assessing the confidence and trust that people have in their institutions, and being able to detect the information environment to see look over the horizon in terms of where government organizations need to be more active in countering either misinformation or disinformation, or where they need to be more proactive to just try to help rebuild confidence. And this gets back to Suzanne's excellent panel on civics, but I think it goes without saying, particularly given what we know our nation-state adversaries are doing, we need to invest in the social science side as well.
All right, well, with that, let's transition to questions from the audience. Anybody brave enough to ask a question? Now, I spent a decade as a professor, so I'm going to use the Socratic method here soon. All right.
So talk to us, if you will, about the need for a Homeland Security Enterprise, not just department, strategy to address R&D going forward. Do we need one, or do we continue with this sort of haphazard, organic R&D efforts?
I guess we're seeing a lot more interest in national strategies, right? OSTP is leading the charge now on a whole range of different emerging technology areas. And I guess as that translates down to the Homeland Security Enterprise, thoughts on how that ecosystem could be more coordinated in its own strategies that integrate across really beyond just whole of government, but really whole of nation, and I think is critical.
So there was an interesting discussion in one of the earlier panels today about the idea of kind of coordinating and controlling at the highest level in terms of what we're doing versus harnessing, right? I think there is value in having a strategy, but I think we need to be careful to not try to kind of control what we're doing. And more, it's a strategy for how we harness what's out there and focus that innovation energy on some of our unique mission areas.
Yeah, I think there's a need for a strategy, but I think that strategy should be about, to what you're saying, the opportunity to bring people together to recognize that you have similar needs, so that you aren't, again, operating in silos. So the strategy should be, and again, if we are really talking about a term of enterprise, it is bringing everyone together so that they can hear that, hey, we have the same need, or we're asking the same questions, so that we don't have to have one-off solutions. And if it is truly a system of systems, you need to have everybody at the table so that they understand what's happening to the left and to the right of them, rather than just what's happening for me.
Yeah, I agree with all those comments. I think the power of the government to convene, and then once it convenes, sort of serve in a quarterback role. I think also, and we've talked about this in several sessions, the government making more clear what it is bringing to the table, as opposed to telling other people what they need to do better, because we've been doing that, as an example, on cyber for a long time. It needs to be clear what they're going to take on in terms of countering the threat, whether it's overseas or here. I think the other piece that government, as it thinks about the enterprise, needs to communicate more clearly to the private sector is how the government will improve the fragmentation of the government itself, right? Okay, let's talk about cyber for a second. Well, when does the FBI help me versus DHS? There's this new policy called Defend Forward. Is that going to make me confident that you're actually better at telling me about the threats that are coming my way, if I agree with you that my job is to protect my patch on the vulnerability side? However, I also think I can't be told to just do better and fend for myself against nation states. Fine, if it's criminals or fraud, fine, I accept that responsibility. but it is the government's responsibility to protect the nation against nation states, right? So a clearer, more directed set of convenings on complex problems. Again, this notion of quarterbacking is key, but then also a clearer statement about what the government will do and how the government will operate more seamlessly.
And if I can just jump in on one of Eddie's points in terms of bringing everybody to the table and breaking through silos, that's really important. And you have to think hard about who all those people you have to bring to the table are. It's not just the technologists and the end users, right? It's also the social scientists, the domain experts. It's also the folks involved in all these processes and policies, right? So that we can bring everybody together and figure out a solution. Because you may figure out something that works really well for technologists, but then we don't actually have the test and evaluation methodologies, or we don't have the other process elements in place. So you have to really be diverse when you're bringing folks to the table to come up with that strategy, if that R&D strategy is actually going to be helpful.
Okay. Any other questions? We've got one back here.
Terry Lee Hoffman-Boswell from MITRE. So I'd just like to pull the thread on that notion with regards to the roles and the role of government when it's a nation-state actor versus the role of industry if it's some other bad actor. How would you know in the moment?
I think there's been a lot of talk historically about attribution, right? I think you prepare for situations regardless of who the threat actor is. Again, I think it is incumbent on the private sector to cover down on vulnerabilities and patch and run training programs and make sure their board is aware of cyber, regardless of who the bad actor is. At the same time, they don't have frequently visibility further left of boom on what's happening. They don't necessarily see all the classified intelligence on what our adversaries are doing. They don't necessarily see those actors, in the US sort of stealing IP or creating command and control infrastructure on commercial networks and infrastructure. That's up to government. So I don't think you have to pre-solve or think about every incident thinking you can't do anything. I think the question presumes that you're waiting to do something until something's actually blown up. Before that, there is a lot more that can happen in terms of government being more open on the information sharing side about the threat, because a lot of companies don't have the wherewithal to see into nation-state threat. I think, again, the Defend Forward strategy, which DoD and DHS are collaborating with, which is you really look, you don't tolerate penetrations by nation states into critical infrastructure and just call it, oh, it's espionage, it happens. And therefore, again, I don't think you have to pre-solve knowing which actor is which. I think you just have to do a better job describing the systemic problems, knowing what the motivations and incentives and activities of our adversaries are. But I appreciate any other thoughts from you guys.
No.
Okay.
That's good.
All right. Well, I think it's been a great discussion. This panel, of course, built, I think, on a lot of the discussion we had in the breakout workshop on emerging technology earlier for those that attended that. So it was great to hear kind of some common themes between the two. It sounds like we need a lot more consortia that are really looking at partnering for research and development rather than traditional requirements-driven acquisition for a lot of these new areas. And I think that's a great direction that can leverage all of the innovation that's happening more broadly in industry towards the Homeland Security Enterprise. So join me in thanking the panel.